how did the decision to implement the Mandal Commission impact Indian politics? Was the decision taken with an eye on gaining political mileage? Did the decision lead to political empowerment of the underprivileged sections of society? I am joined today by a very distinguished panel of experts to discuss some of these issues. My first guest on this program is Hilal Ahmed, an assistant professor at the Center for Studies in Developing Society; Sandhya Jain, a very senior journalist, a columnist of repute, also an author; Subrata Mukherjee, a very eminent political scientist, retired after teaching for decades in the Delhi University. Professor Mukherjee, let me begin with you to first try to visit. We are talking about 25 years ago, about which today's contemporary generations would possibly have little memories of that. First we need to revive those memories, and also to help us contextualize the decision of the VP Singh government to suddenly announce the decision to implement parts of the Mandal Commission report granting reservation 27% to OBCs in government and PhD jobs as well as in educational institutions.
Let's look to a bit historically.
Yes.
You know that when the constitution came into force,
right,
and then the first election, Congress polled over 43% of the votes, and Nehru was very unhappy. He wanted that at least 50% votes are necessary. Okay, and that's how the long talk with Jayaprakash Narayan. You see, because the socialist two parties together polled about 16% of the votes. Of course, the talks failed. Now, why do I refer to this is because if you really look to the Constituent Assembly debate, you will find that there was an overall consensus and awareness that what we have achieved is the national liberation,
right,
national revolution, but not the social revolution. And that's how Grenville Austin talks of the seamless webs. You remember that democracy, unity and social revolution. And you will also find that at that time there was a larger acceptance that we are to move very quickly. I will quote Santhanam for instance again, that you look to that we have two choices, evolutionary change,
right,
or a revolutionary change. So, the temper of the time was for quick accommodation and spread and deepening of the democracy.
Right.
Unfortunately, what we find that the 50s, instead of certain boldness in reforming the state, like the police reform, judicial reform, and also these kind of social principles and policies, we find that Nehru's policies were essentially conservative.
Right.
And that led to the Asian drama kind of a syndrome, that is soft state, not the capacity to take hard decision and things like that. Now, if you really look to the post-Nehruvian period and come to 77, you remember the Janata Party and Lok Dal
right,
were the two really caste-based parties
right,
of North India, and Janata Party's election manifesto clearly said we want reservation.
We want reservations, yes.
Okay. And that's how Mandal Commission
was
came.
set up during the Janata Party.
Right, and if you really look to the reasoning in the Mandal Commission, I think it was quite well done.
Right.
I'll just give one example of the extensive work that Mandal did, was that mention of the new class.
Can I come to that a bit later? Let me try to move to Sandhya Jain to get also some kind of what Professor Mukherjee is saying, that there was a certain historical basis on which the VP Singh government took the decision to announce the Mandal Commission.
I have some little reservations.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter, which I agree with Professor Mukherjee, that the Nehruvian era, I would say this period was a period of stagnation for India.
Right.
This is a period economic, lot of stagnation, not enough being done, and there seems to be no desire on the part of the government to really push specifically in the arena of education. Because you have talked about, your program is about reservations, the whole episode on which it rests, the justification or lack of justification will rest on the spread of education,
right,
which never happened. This frustration of the Nehruvian years impacted on Mrs. Gandhi, and she had to handle it in her own way. And then we come to what he says is the Mandal Commission.
Right.
The Mandal Commission, and I think after Professor Ahmed has spoken, I will, when we come back out to that, it was not well done at all.
Right. Let's listen to him. What Hilal Ahmed says. That how do you contextualize the Mandal Commission? Quarter of a century, a long time ago.
Yeah. I think Professor Mukherjee has given us a political reference to a political discourse.
Right.
So I won't comment on that, but it would be important to look at the policy discourse as well.
Right.
And the policy discourse I refer to again from look at the constitution, because constitution says that you have to have to identify other forms of backwardness.
Exactly.
And because the mandate of constitution
try to rectify those
yes
reasons.
And the mandate of constitution is to create social equality, not merely economic equality. And for the sake of social equality, first backward classes commission was constituted. That is called Kaka Kalekar committee. Kaka Kalekar committee, they came out with a very strange kind of an argument that economic basis should be the criteria by which you identify backwardness.
Right.
And then from Kaka Kalekar there were several state level commissions constituted, and it became a state issue in a big way. Mandal was the first policy landmark which actually reconstituted all the things and
which looked at also caste.
Yes, evoked the question of caste in a very significant way. It says that social equality cannot be understood without referring to the social structure. And since Indian society is primarily based on caste structure, therefore you have to...
economic structure is also linked to caste in India.
Yes, so you have to take caste seriously. And by that time, from 1931 onward, we did not have any caste census.
Right.
So what Mandal did, they took 1931 caste census as a reference
and
point.
they didn't, they worked it on the basis of assumptions.
Yes, not merely assumptions. Not merely assumptions. No, because they did some sample surveys as well.
Okay.
And came out that, on the basis of a statistical method, they came out with a formula to identify backwardness on the basis of caste. But it was not essentialism, I would say. Mandal was not essentialist. Why? Because they were also looking at the fact of religion. They came out the fact that in the Hindu caste structure or Hindu caste composition cannot be imposed on other non-Hindu religious communities. Therefore, the criteria for identifying backwardness in different communities should be different. So they came out with a different kind of solution. So that policy discourse need to be taken seriously while we are referring to political arguments, which Professor Mukherjee very clearly pointed out. One more thing which is very important is that in India, and it is coming from right from the, because constitution was an outcome of a national movement.
Yes.
So
and also the part of a certain development on its own, if you take into account the various, in whichever forms the constitution existed prior to before the Constituent Assembly began, 1935 document, which provided a huge amount of basis of what eventually became the Indian Constitution.
So the most important because it came out from a movement.
Right.
So it had some kind of an intrinsic soft corner for movement. There was no theory of power in that. Therefore, when you were, and look at 1950 debates, Nehru was in power and he is saying that Bihar protest is not political. So the meaning of political became somehow, if you are doing movement, it is political. But if you are doing governance, you are not political. Because constitution has got, it tilted towards movement part. And the most important point, the outcome was in the later discourse was that victimhood became a reference point for doing politics. And because victimhood was so central in our political discourse, so that's why it became
that is why reservations start becoming very central to our governance.
Yes, it became a permanent marker of victimhood. So if you to say that I am victim, I need reservation. So that was
so let's this is an interesting argument, Professor Mukherjee, that I am a victim, so I am entitled to reservation. Is this the way you say that this possibly sustain the practice of reservation in India? If you go back and look at the debates and look at as to when the time period was there, reservations even for scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, well, there was basically time frame, but then it has become, it acquired some kind of a permanence in Indian politics, if I may use this particular phrase.
Well, then one is to look to the Pune Pact. That one great achievement of Gandhi, that he did not allow the Hindu society to disintegrate or split. And after that, it was in the mind of everybody, the constitution making process, that India is a situation of major contradictions. And there are a lot of people have been left out. They are also very aware of the fact that the national movement itself is primarily a middle class movement. You see the lawyers and the upper class and the rich. So lot of things are to be done. And at that particular juncture,
Maybe
they
it
were
would
very
be
clear.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Maybe it would be probably better to say that the leadership of the national movement was in the hand of the middle class, but as far as participation goes, that probably there was a much wider participation.
Well, the participation alcohol still was very limited. Remember that there was never conscription in the British Jamana. I like to read out a couplet that was to be given by the British, भर्ती हो जा रे रंगरूट, इधर पहनता फटा पुराना, उधर पहनेगा नया बूट. So what I mean that the number of people who really participated in the national movement was very limited. Look to the Quit India movement. Only 60,000 people went to the jail, which is a very, very small number. So this is reflected in Gandhi throughout. You look to his experiments with truth. All the time he is saying that, the Indian are unmanly. That's one reason he said that we should be allowed to carry firearms.
Well, that's a similar kind of an argument which Savarkar used to make.
The critique, of course, there is a lot of similarity.
But they had a huge amount of disagreements
also. The critique of the Punjab people at that particular moment towards the end of the experiments. But let's come to the reality that the nation building exercise, that the Nehruvian plan was to make up for the lost time. Now technically, Homi Bhabha explained it. For instance, we have missed the industrial revolution. We cannot afford to miss the atomic revolution. That was one way of putting it.
Yes.
The other was the Nehruvian plan of rapid industrialization and incorporating everybody in the developmental process. But there, of course, there are many fault lines in it. But the fact remains that the independence itself was not political. And here I would like to point out that Indian revolution also points out to a serious limitation of Hannah Arendt's theory of revolution. Because her argument is very simple. A successful revolution is to be limited to the political, but Indian national movement and the subsequent epoch really proves that we combined successfully a political and a social one.
Right. Well said. We'll take a little break at this point in time and then come back and resume this conversation. The underlying principle of caste-based reservations in public jobs and education was that this was needed to uplift the conditions of the underprivileged. Quite often it has been stated that it was time for India to move on from this principle. But the question is that is India ready? Don't go away, this program will continue. Welcome back to a page from history. It is a quarter of a century since the VP Singh government announced its intention to implement the Mandal Commission report. Sanjay Jain, let's try to get down to a bit more of specifics. We are talking about the VP Singh government, we have been referring to it. We have had a very interesting discussion in the first part, but we have really not tried to understand the nuts and bolts of politics. Let's try to get a journalist sense from you, somebody who was covering it from the ringside at that particular time.
7th of August 1989 is when VP Singh suddenly announced this at the boat club.
Yeah.
And he announced it on, I think, the day before Devi Lal was supposed to have a similar rally where he was
celebrate his birthday,
where he was supposed to be throwing his hat in the ring again to challenge him.
Right.
In fact, Devi Lal, when the election took place, wanted to be the Prime Minister.
Right.
As a journalist, I had told some of my colleagues that Devi Lal has thrown his hat in the ring, and nobody believed it. Then he formally put his hat in the ring, and then of course a lot of pressure was put for him to withdraw. Chandrasekhar played a role, and VP Singh was the PM, which Devi Lal never reconciled to. So VP Singh, fearing a challenge to his throne, suddenly came up with Mandal Commission. Mandal Commission, as Professor Saab has said, was created by the Janata, short-lived Janata.
Right.
It submitted its report when Mrs. Gandhi was back in
and then
power.
It was in the cold storage for many years.
Full decade,
for 10
for a full decade, and then suddenly it was brought out. What you may or may not remember is that it was part of the
manifesto of the Janata Dal.
Of the Janata Dal, certainly.
Yes.
But do you know it was also there with the BJP?
Yes, it was.
And I asked a senior leader, I said, when you people are so unhappy with the Mandal Commission, how is it that it was in your manifesto?
Because by the time the general presupposition was that manifestos, you make promises which you really do not have to fulfill after becoming.
But did you know
so
that
it was only for the record.
Manifestos in that era were probably written without understanding what they meant.
Right.
A very senior leader admitted to me personally that nobody knew what the Mandal Commission was.
Right.
It was one of those things like free education, free water, Arvind Kejriwal style. It was just
Right.
put in, and they were in a fix when it came. The point about the Mandal Commission is that once the report came into the public domain, all the eminent sociologists associated with it, from Andre Bethe onwards, Professor Roy Burman, and very, very many eminents whose names we don't recall, but they had come out in public and said they opposed the report. They did not like the way Mandal did the work, because the basic premise that you have to define backwardness was ignored,
Yes.
and the whole report went in favor, the slant is towards certain castes which were very muscular in the countryside, which were landed, which were rich. So this dissociation of wealth from
Right.
status, social status, and your actual position, dominant caste, which Srinivasan talked about, is fallacious. I don't think they can be conflated, and the debate which we are having today is linked with that also.
Right. Hilal Ahmed, somebody who reads statements, who tries to understand policy, let's not look at it from what we say, from the journalistic perspective of what was going behind the scene. From your reading of VP Singh, the man, VP Singh, the politician, VP Singh, the statesman, his decision, how much of it do you see was purely a populist measure to evade the threat that he was facing from within his party, and the dream of actually taking a decision which could lead to some kind of a revolutionary transformation of Indian polity?
Actually, again, we have to, expand the scope of the term called context in this sense, because that not merely, because at that time, 1990s, VP Singh not merely fighting with his own colleagues, but also BJP. BJP was coming in a big way. And
there was definitely a tussle for a very common support base.
Yeah.
The same kind of a caste basis was there.
So in that sense, if you look at if you look at the social background of JP movement, you can very clearly identify that certain castes which we club in OBC category were very active politically
during the
Janata Party
yes.
and in the JP movement.
Right.
And they got they consolidated themselves politically. What VP Singh did politically in order to fight BJP, it was very important for someone to just unpack the caste question. And that unpacking of caste gave some sort of a new discourse to VP Singh. It was not available before that, because if you look
also
at
had spent his entire career in the Congress,
obviously,
and he stepped out of the Congress only because of personal animosity with Rajiv Gandhi, not
at
because
that
of
point of time,
any principled position which led to him taking the decision on Mandal Commission.
If you look at from 1987 onward,
from the time the Bofors controversy came out,
controversy till Mandal Commission,
right,
you will find that the pace by which BJP increased its political impact, particularly in North India, was unprecedented during the Ram Temple movement.
From just 2 members in parliament, in between
in by-election they performed very well,
yes.
and in most of the assembly elections they performed very, very well. Now in that context, someone like VP Singh, it is very important to create a very different kind of a discourse by which you can not merely deviate the agenda of earlier was that we are for secularism, or we are in this communal secular element was dominating at that point of time. Mandal Commission as a political creation, gave us a new language of politics, and that language again destroyed BJP in a big way, even during the heydays of Ram Temple. So in my view, we need to understand the significance of Mandal as a political discourse, because after that backwardness became a new language of politics. Not merely that, look at what UPA did from Mandal onward, and we have to also look at
this entire phrase called Mandalization of Indian politics.
Yes,
that is,
and Mandal is also inextricably linked to the economic reforms. we have to understand that earlier reservation policies had got some relationship with nation building exercise.
Right.
But in post liberalization phase, in post 1990 period, you have got extreme liberalization and you have got a discourse of backwardness.
Right.
So you have got caste, but caste is approached not in a comprehensive way. You have got Sachar Commission report, you have got Sen Gupta report and things like that.
Right.
You are addressing backwardness not in a comprehensive sense, rather in episodic way.
Right. Professor Mukherjee, once again coming back to the basic question, VP Singh, you know that when he takes a decision, you know, we're talking about suddenly he takes a decision because probably worried that Devi Lal, who's threatening his position, wanting to become Prime Minister, having a big rally to celebrate his birthday, so he wants to have something bigger, steal the thunder, if one can actually call it, you know, that is it. Do you, as an academic, do you go back and look at it as a kind of a knee-jerk reaction, or do you read some kind of a prior strategizing and planning in the decision to announce the Mandal Commission report?
Well, Nilanjan, the point is that issues become political at a particular time and place. Even if Devi Lal would not have been there, some form of Mandal Commission would have been there.
It would have been
in
there.
the coming years. I give you the reason. You see, the post-Congress period, in a way, if you really look to Sanjukta Vidhayak Dal,
Right.
you know, 67 onwards, you will find that the two components who are championing this caste connotation were the Lok Dal, that is Charan Singh, and the socialists, Lohiites. Now, in the context of that, it gets a historic setting and meaning. Now, what really happened during the last 2 decades that really empowered these people to claim a position in administration? You see, bullock cart capitalism, that's what Rudolph talks about it. We find the economic empowerment, you see, and the political empowerment. Political empowerment through parliament became visible. Legislative assemblies came under their control.
Right.
That was also visible. But there was a certain amount of incompleteness in it, because in the administration they did not have their presence. So the point that comes is that 77 to 90, if you really look to the entire process, this view was consolidating. And if you really look to the way it happened, that when the Supreme Court really delivered the verdict, by that time all the political parties supported Mandal.
This is you're
Why
talking about
did
the
it happen?
1992 judgment.
Right.
Right.
So why did it happen? So the consensus that came later was in the process itself, and it would
But
have come either way.
somebody had to come and catalyze that entire process, and you feel that if it had not been VP Singh, someone else would have come about. There would have been probably some other scenario which probably led to such an announcement.
That's what I think.
That is what I think.
I would agree with that.
I
I think
we will take another break at this point and then come back and resume this conversation. The phrase Mandal Kamandal became an expression to argue that the BJP's decision to launch Lal Krishna Advani's Somnath to Ayodhya Rath Yatra was in response to VP Singh's move. But I am sure there will be an opinion contrary to this. Stay tuned in. We will be back shortly. Welcome back to a page from history. It is 25 years since the VP Singh government's decision to implement part of the recommendations of the Mandal Commission report split Indian politics vertically. Sanjay Jain, Mandal Kamandal, that was a phrase which journalists had created at that point, said that Mandal Commission, the BJP was worried that, to use a very popular phrase, that the ground was shifting beneath its feet, that it realized that its mass space was shifting away because there was division within Hindu society, and the Ayodhya movement from 1984 onward started, but more aggressively from 87 onward, led to an all-encompassing Hindu solidarity which was getting frittered away because Hindu castes were pit against each other. That is why, to counter that, the entire Somnath to Ayodhya Rath Yatra was conceived and taken out. What's your view on this?
In retrospect,
Yes.
now, we have to perhaps feel that it was not so much as counter as contain
Right.
the threat from Mandal.
Or the limit the damage.
The
damage was happening.
Professor Ahmed has already said that consolidation of a non-Congress type was taking place under
Right.
the BJP. It was the emerging pole of society,
Yes.
and today it is the alternate
Yes.
party.
Not
So-
alternate, the only party. The others
Today.
are alternate now.
Now, when Mandal, as Professor Mukherjee said, was going to come in some form because the peasant castes were unhappy with Nehruji and they were unhappy with Indira Gandhi. The people who have benefited from Mandal are basically the Yadavs, the Kurmis, Koris, Jats and all that. Not Jats, we will come to Jats later. And they are the ones who would have forced it because they were agricultural castes who felt that they were out of the system, and we have to understand that. These are the castes which also drew towards BJP, and BJP was consolidating them when the Mandal happened. And to counter and contain the Mandal fallout, BJP did the Janmabhoomi Yatra of Mr. Advani, in which one of the star performers was Uma Bharti. Another lesser recognized person at that time was Narendra Modi. But the star show was that time stolen by Pramod Mahajan because he was a more flamboyant personality.
Narendra Modi in the 1990 Yatra was, his role was primarily confined to organizing the start of the movement.
All the legs,
from
he did it a lot.
Gujarat and till Maharashtra. Mr. Modi becomes much more important on the Ekta Yatra, which
becomes
is
important much later. Actually, he becomes important.
But yes, that's the first time when he steps into national, politics. That's the first time that we reporters in India, in Delhi, become aware of the fact that there is a young, dynamic, fairly capable BJP leader emerging in Gujarat. Many of us who travel to Gujarat.
So this is containment, part of the containment, because RSS we have to talk about because they own the BJP, 100% equity holders, you can say.
That's a very controversial statement you're saying.
I said it to them, so I'm not saying something new. They come out with Raju Bhaiya as the Sarsang Chalak for the first time, a non-Brahmin.
Right.
This is
and that was from North India.
Possibly a response
that too
to
from North
Mandal.
India, more important.
And a lot of the current non-Brahmin leadership of the BJP, including Mr. Modi, Uma Bharti, Venkaiah Naidu, Bangaru Lakshman, Rajnath Singh, all these people.
That is what was defined by
and all that.
Govindacharya's point is that this is the part of social engineering within the BJP.
So they had started, these people were probably rising on their own. I won't say they are artificial promotions. Many of them are grassroots leaders.
This is very important.
Shivraj Singh and all, they get their chance.
I think you have reminded us of something. Let me just get Hilal Ahmed's sense on this. The rise of OBC leaders within the BJP, unprecedented in an organization which was so deeply rooted in the RSS, which was known for a fairly Brahminical dominance for several decades, right from the 1920s. To what extent did the political process which was initiated by Mandal Commission, by the events which led to a situation where there was a ground was created that Mandal Commission got accepted, did it lead to the changing caste nature of the leadership in the BJP?
Not merely in BJP, in all political parties. All political parties, because of two very obvious reasons. One is that if you look at, we have to be very conscious about OBC, the nature of reservation, the difference between OBC and ST. OBC reservation is primarily reservation in jobs. It does not have got any political reservation. Why?
But education, they have it. And
education and not any constituency reserved for them, except in very bottom level of society, in panchayats, in some states, because the state has that is a state subject. For example,
the number of OBC MPs within Parliament went up hugely from 89 onwards. If you study the caste profile, whatever little studies have been done, shows that 89 onwards, the character of Parliament started changing.
No, exactly. That's my point. That if you look at, because if you look at, as I said, that from 1977 onward, OBC, which we called OBC now, these castes were politically very active. And when these castes actually got some sort of reservation, the moral, that political moral, it became, you tend to realize a sense of empowerment, and then that empowerment cannot be ignored by all political party. And that was the reason why, not merely in BJP, in all political parties, OBC leaders actually became, earlier they were they were not considered to be backward in that sense, but after Mandal Commission, they have got certain recognition of backwardness as well. So in order to make your party inclusive, you have to accommodate those leaders as well. So as a party strategy, as you said, that all political, there was a consensus that, you know, OBC reservation, nobody is going to oppose it. Since no political party was going to oppose it, in order to show you are inclusive political party, you have to accommodate these leaders on the one hand, while on the other hand, because of reservation, your morals are high, and you would actually demand your equitable share inside political spectrum. That was really happening. Since 1990s now, you have got various MPs coming out of OBC. I've got one another point which is very important in that sense, because after this creamy layer judgment came up,
right.
Now you have to, you know,
you have to
creamy
layer means, you know, adding an economic component into caste
basis. After that, you know, backwardness of OBC got a very different trajectory of its own, and that's why division among the OBC became a big issue,
right.
Particularly in Bihar, where Karpuri formula was actually implemented, saying that OBC is not a uniform homogeneous category. You have to create two groups. One is most backward and other is other backward.
Now you have an entirely different electoral,
yes,
you know,
Nitish Kumar
is a group called MBCs.
MBCs.
Yes.
So the fallout of that was that OBC, this creamy layer thing,
right.
The fallout was that within OBC you can have you know, fragmentation, and that fragmentation became politically very vibrant in later years.
Professor Mukherjee, you know, this fragmentation of the OBC constituency, the creation of the concept of MBC, you know, where do you think how much of this fragmentation has actually happened on ground, and to what extent would you like to see it getting further fragmented? Because once you split up an atom, there can be a continuous process that you break it down further after a few years.
It is very different from one state to another. You know, for instance, you remember at the time of the Mandal Commission, OBC had to be invented in Bengal, right. You know, and so Bihar, it worked in a different manner. I would like to your question from a different perspective. Now, politics is a game of numbers. Now, the big difference between South India and the North India is that the upper caste population number is much more in Uttar Pradesh. For instance, in South it is about 10%, and with more industrialization and self-respect movement, the Brahmins were out of power for a very long time, yes. And they made it in Infosys and culture, okay, and they are thriving it quite all right. But in the context of Uttar Pradesh particularly, not of Bihar, Brahmin is a very sizable vote bank. I think what the BJP aim was, that's the inner meaning of Advani's, that in Uttar Pradesh, where we are not exactly a very important force, what we try to work out is the upper caste consolidation. And by that time it also became clear that the OBC reservation will have a backlash in organizing the SC/STs in a different manner, and that's what Kanshiram Mayawati did,
right.
So successfully. So there was a balancing thing within the OBC and the scheduled caste and then the Brahmins. So in that way it became 33, 33, 33,
right.
Where BJP will always remain meaningful. But that was not the same thing in Bihar. That's why Lalu could stop Advani very easily.
Right.
Probably that would not have been possible
in some other
in
state.
Uttar Pradesh.
In Uttar Pradesh. There would have been probably a huge protest from within the people. They would have come into the streets and actually protested the government decision.
And that's the reason, if I may add, that the protest against Mandal was much more in north than in south.
Right. Is that also the way you look at it, Sandhya, very quickly?
In the south, the reservation policies were also more deeply entrenched. They had been done slowly over a period of time.
Right.
In Tamil Nadu, it was 69% when Mandal came, and they said we cannot cut back so much, which Supreme Court insisted that they do. But I think the more contemporary thing that we have to look at today is the recent, I think last year's judgment of the Supreme Court on the demand of the Jats for inclusion in OBC.
Right.
Where the Supreme Court has clearly said that you have had a Prime Minister, Chaudhry Charan Singh, you are a very well-off community. There has to be something more than political appeasement.
OBC as a Prime Minister, even before Mr. Modi, you had Deve Gowda, who was an OBC, who had become Prime Minister. So I do not know whether this argument of the Supreme Court that just because one representative of yours has touched the pinnacle of power
and they are a land-endowed community. Right. They are well represented everywhere.
Probably a better way would be, as what Professor Mukherjee was saying, that it's not just a question of looking at state to state, but it's also a question of this very peculiar dichotomy that whereas the Jats can be considered to be the OBCs in Rajasthan, in some of the state they do not work out that way. So there are contradictions. We'll talk about it when we come back for after another short little break. Very few Indian political leaders have been bitterly criticized like VP Singh has been. Fewer have impacted Indian politics as profoundly as he did. The same is also often said about Lal Krishna Advani. The jury is still out and people have different views. We will continue this debate. Be with us. Welcome back to a page from history. It is 25 years since the government of the day decided to reserve 27% of jobs and seats for OBCs. The decision remains a cusp in Indian political history. Hilal Ahmed, 25 years, a lot of developments has happened. There's been a lot of transformative changes within Indian politics. But when you sit back and look at these 25 years, how do you look at this general discourse over the issue of reservation, issue of caste-based reservation, continuing inability or rather the refusal of Indian political parties to once again actually understand who are we as Indians. We refuse to have the caste component in the 2011 census. Eventually what was done is not, from what I understand, though whatever little data is available has not been made available in the public domain, but experts who study demography feel that the manner in which it was done would not in any way be able to give us a correct picture of as to how Indian caste matrix is currently. How do you look at this last 25 years and what are the things that you see as the biggest challenges which faces Indian politicians as well as Indian academicians and analysts?
I think we have got a certain words by which we play our politics and unfortunately our academics as well. Right. Caste is one of them. We have not yet looked at caste in its, if you look at our policy in relation to caste, it is based on many assumptions and it is not based on any systematic analysis, which is quite rather unfortunate.
Right.
We really don't know. For example, in 2011 when this issue of socio-economic caste came up, there were three positions. Right. One is that
it kept on getting changed. If you actually look at it in August 2010 onwards, the government, the UPA government of that time kept on changing its cabinet decision month after month.
Yes. So the first opinion was that there should be no caste.
No caste. Then there should be a inclusion
OBC,
of caste.
ST, OBC, and then all caste.
And then they decided to take it outside the Census Act.
Yes.
So eventually what is there is technically not a census, though it is being called a socio-economic caste census.
But if you look at the questionnaire which was actually circulated and which was on the basis of this data was collected, it's quite misleading. And I agree with you that it is very impossible. It is next to impossible to actually, 1930 was a different context. 1931 was a different context in which the census was done very
people
very
were also listing themselves as particular caste with a certain amount of motivation which needs to be understood.
Yeah, but things have changed completely now. Now, in this context, if you just look back in last 25 years, I think 2-3 things are very clear. One is that, and I also underline in first segment, that our attitude towards backwardness is rather, it's not systematic. We have not yet looked at backwardness in its comprehensiveness. So you have got caste, you have got class, and you have got now gender and many other things. So we should have some kind of indexing of backwardness systematically. That is one thing for the policy discourse. But when it comes to politics, because you have to remember that SC, ST and OBC, these are administrative categories and these are impermanent, these are not permanent categories. The philosophy of reservation is that you enter, you get benefit and you get out.
And you opt, you should
but have. Now because there is a consensus that we should not talk about the exit policy. Therefore, what is happening that
everybody wants to talk only about
the entry point. And therefore, it has become very difficult to think backwardness in that way.
Right. Professor Mukherjee, how important do you think it is for us to really try to understand who we are as a people, in terms of that who's what? What is actually the true character of Indian society? Why should we shy away? Everyone keeps on talking caste, but when it comes to enumerating caste, we want to make it a big question mark, a big mystery, because probably everybody wants to play with it.
Well, I think caste is a reality. And
So then why try to
whether
escape
in the urban areas, probably we downplay it, but the fact remains that it is in our blood in a way. I just look to the Kurukshetra novel, you know, there is the upper caste consolidation that has taken place in Bengal. You know, like that, you see, there is always adjustment, but the fact is that there is a caste consciousness amongst us, but we should not decry it. That's the important point. Rajni Kothari onwards, if you really look to, it is looked to as a positive aspect. For instance, M.N. Srinivas thought that in the 50s that the electoral consideration has given the impetus to caste, but that I think is too simplistic. What has really brought in this caste question in the context of the uneven development in India, and why this present caste census is important. You look to the landowning category. The same category of people in Karnataka has lot of land, but in Uttar Pradesh they are landless. Now, if you really work out a correct policy, first important thing we have to realize, as Gandhi did, is to be a decentralized kind of a policy framework. And if you really want to do it, you will have to differentiate from A state to B state. And if you want to do it, I think you require a caste census. However faulty it may be, but unless you do it, the planning process will always remain incomplete.
Sandhya, do you have a slightly different?
We definitely have to have a different perspective in the 21st century. Caste is no longer linked to the old indices when it was linked to your the occupation you will have, to whether you will have an education or not, to whether you will be a moneyed person with social status or not. That whole dynamics from the 20th century has been changing, and in the 21st century, caste doesn't even apply most of the time to marriage. That was the last frontier. Now the honor killings,
limited
areas which are taking place in the countryside are what? The resistance to caste as a barometer for marriage. So every landmark, every indice is breaking down. It's just your name and your origin now. That's the reality. You have to, as Ahmed has said, have an indexing of backwardness, which is what the experts associated with Mandal Commission said. There has to be an economic criteria.
But this indexing also must probably include caste as one of the components.
Certainly. The caste may or may not be related to it, but because if you have huge land ownership, you're not backward or socially disempowered or anyway. It's a fraud then. The aspect of, we have to now look beyond caste. As I said in the beginning, we have to have education, we have to have carpet bombing of schools, district-wise inadequate number all over the country.
You know, it's really nice what Sandhya Jain is saying, that we should look beyond caste. But the question, Hilal Ahmed, is that or rather, do you see Indian society in the near future looking beyond caste identity?
I think caste is, I agree that caste is not the caste of 1931. Caste has become a class in its own ways, and it is a political identity.
But it is also a matter of identity.
And it is a political identity now.
Yes.
It's a strong political identity. So you cannot
But it's also
give
social.
away.
It continues to be a social identity also.
Yeah, because it has got certain social linkages. So you have got classification.
You can pick up matrimonial columns in any newspaper or website. You'll still find caste-based listings.
Yeah. So you have got, that's what I'm saying, that there is a classization of caste and politicization of caste. So caste is not merely a social identity, it has got its own politics as well. Now, if we really want to understand all these three dynamics, caste as a political identity, caste as an economic entity, and caste as a cultural, cultural sense of belonging, I think the index which I'm talking about should have all these three.
Right. Right. Professor Mukherjee, as we get into towards the concluding part of this program, if I ask you a very question, that you have been a political scientist. Political scientist, by nature you would have possibly studied the deficiencies as well as the advantages, or rather the gains which has been made by the political leaders, by the political parties. Now, on a situation like caste, when we talk about, Sandhya Jain was talking about that we are now in the 21st century, we have to change our thinking. What kind of a leadership or rather what kind of initiatives would you like the political leadership to take in regard to reshaping our social and public discourse of caste?
Well, I think Sandhya should remember that India is 1000 years living together. That how many of us live actually in the 21st century is a very questionable thing. You stand in a road in Delhi, you just look to the vehicles that are there, from a rickshaw to a Mercedes Benz, and the people who are walking, their dress and other things. It will take a lot of time to reach the ideal of a 21st century. You cannot shorten the pace of history just by announcing it. You know, we tried it earlier, the modernization theory also tried it, and it only met with a limited success. So we have to work together, and in the context, caste will continue to be an important identity, mainly in the context where the organized sector is so small and it is becoming smaller. So where are the really the points where one can accelerate and move from one place to another? I don't see that happening in India. Primordial loyalties, agricultural societies are normally tradition bound. You read Durkheim, you read anybody, when it happened in Europe, it took a much longer time, and even I think in India, it will definitely take a much longer time.
Right.
I think
Very
people have
important
lost
point.
their patience.
Let me also just set the pace for, tone for what you would like to say. Professor Mukherjee is also introduces that the size of the unorganized sector in India is increasing. Now, when you are increasing the size of the unorganized sector in the working class, you possibly also talking about greater amount of fragmentation of the Indian, the lowest common multiple, if I can use that particular phrase. In a situation like that, how can you possibly talk about completely eliminating caste, and what kind of initiatives would you like to see?
I'm not eliminating. I'm very conscious of my caste identity as cultural identity, as he has said, and that's not the point. Well, it's there, and why not?
Okay. Yes.
And my son has a different caste. I had an intercaste marriage, so we are both very conscious, and that's it. It's just an identity.
But
and
that should not be the reason
impact.
for. But you would not want that to become the universal basis of privileges and
How
rights.
can it be?
And rights.
And that's what I'm saying. The intercaste marriage is now such an extremely pervasive, pervading
But still, there is a
phenomenon.
huge amount of social resistance to intercaste
there is some
marriages.
resistance, and that is also that will remain. The change and the tradition which Professor Sabs talked is going to continue always. We will be a tradition-bound society, and that is good because that will keep us rooted. We will not be uprooted like other societies, but we will change also. The latest example, I have talked repeatedly about education. Please remember, Dr. Bala Saheb Ambedkar, the doctor in his name, is not from medicine. He went to Columbia University and became a PhD there. It's not easy even today to get into Columbia. Today, 2 Dalit boys, brothers in Rajasthan, in a small village in Rajasthan, cracked the merit listing of IIT.
But
that's not a small thing, and now help is pouring into.
You can always have exceptions, but that they cannot. For it to become rules that you possibly.
You have to make the education universal.
You cannot possibly cite cases of
school education has to be standardized and made uniform and universal in India. Without that, there is nothing.
Lal Ahmed.
Yeah, I think I think as I said that there should be some indexing and there should be some brainstorming for that. That is required. But apart from that, there is an important aspect which we must underline, and that is there should be some relationship of policy discourse in relation to backwardness with the changing economic realities of India.
Right.
You have got state rolling back. You have got very limited seats. You have got educational institution run by public on public fund rolling back. You have got private players coming in, and we do not have.
So whatever little of public space you have needs to be equally divided among people, especially who are among the deprived.
And the private players, they also have to recognize the diversity of this society. Unless
Well, that is a very controversial point. About private players wanting to, or rather being advised and being told to take into account that yes, there is need for
affirmative action there.
Yes, affirmative action, which is there in large number of other countries. But as far as India is concerned, probably this is the right time 25 years after the Mandal Commission was
So if we really want
introduced.
to introduce
This is the right time to
Sabka
actually,
Vikas, we have to
is actually the right time to introduce that debate within Indian politics. Thank you very much for coming and joining me on this program.
Thank you.
No one would like India to go back to the days of early 1990s when there were so much protests. But the issue of assisting those who are socially, economically and educationally behind the privileged sections also cannot be ignored. Yet, there should also be attempts at forging political consensus, and not just on this issue but also on others. We have never given our viewpoint on the issue that we debate. The idea is to provide an informed cross-section of viewpoints to enable you to form your own opinion. Do give us your feedback on this program and write to us. Our email ID is historylstv@gmail.com. We will return next week. There will be another page from history and another panel of experts. Till then, goodbye.